It had been a rough year. After the relentless grind of office work, failed relationships, and a mounting sense of isolation, I needed an escape. A small, secluded cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect solution. Tucked away from civilization and surrounded by dense forest, it promised the solitude I craved. The realtor assured me it was a bargain due to its unique location, and despite some nagging reservations, I decided to buy it. The cabin was quaint, rustic, and charming in its own way. It had wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a large front porch that overlooked a serene lake. I felt a rush of relief as I unloaded my belongings and settled in. The isolation was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. For the first few days, everything was idyllic. I explored the surrounding forest, fished in the lake, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to sense something was off. It started subtly. The occasional sound of rustling outside my window, shadows that seemed to move just out of sight, and a growing feeling of being watched. One evening, after a particularly long day of hiking, I was sitting by the fire when I noticed something unusual. A small handwritten note had appeared on the mantelpiece. It was written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. "I'm watching you. I know you're alone." My heart skipped a beat. I scanned the room, but there was no sign of anyone. I tried to brush it off as a prank from someone who had visited the cabin before me. I tore up the note and threw it in the fireplace, watching as it turned to ash. But the unsettling feeling remained. That night I struggled to sleep. The cabin creaked and groaned as if it were alive. Every sound seemed amplified in the dead of night. The wind howling, branches scratching against the windows, and the distant call of owls. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had settled over me. The next morning, I decided to investigate the cabin's surroundings, hoping that getting out of the house would clear my mind. I ventured deeper into the forest, following a narrow trail that seemed to lead nowhere. After walking for hours, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated shack hidden among the trees. Its wooden walls were weathered and covered in ivy, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore. Inside, the shack was in a state of decay. Dust-covered furniture, broken glass, and cobwebs covered every surface. But what caught my attention was a collection of old photographs scattered across a table. They were black and white, showing various people, some smiling, others with vacant expressions. The most disturbing thing was that every photo featured a man with a face obscured by shadows or scratched out. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that the man in the photographs resembled the shadowy figure I had sensed in the cabin. I left the shack quickly, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I had no idea what I had stumbled upon, but the eerie coincidence was too much to ignore. That night, the unsettling atmosphere in the cabin reached a new level. I awoke to a loud banging noise coming from the basement. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to break through the walls. Trembling, I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously descended the creaky stairs. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and storage boxes. The banging noise continued, coming from behind a large, dusty curtain. I pulled the curtain aside, revealing a small room with a wooden table and a collection of old tools. On the wall was a series of disturbing drawings depicting people trapped in cages and grotesque figures with distorted faces. The drawings were crude but unsettling, hinting at some sort of twisted obsession. My flashlight beam fell on a large metal box in the corner. It was locked and had strange symbols etched into its surface. The banging noise was coming from inside the box, and I could hear muffled, panicked noises. My heart raced as I realized that someone, or something, might be trapped inside. I tried to open the box, but it was securely locked. The banging grew more frantic, and the muffled cries became clearer. Desperate, I used a crowbar to pry open the box, and when it finally gave way, I was met with a sight that made me recoil in horror. Inside the box was a young woman, bound and gagged. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she struggled weakly against her restraints. I quickly untied her and called the authorities, my hands shaking as I tried to explain the situation. The woman was rescued, and the police took her to safety, but the horror of what I had found lingered. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The strange occurrences continued. Noises in the walls, shadows moving on their own, and the constant feeling of being followed. I discovered more notes scattered around the cabin, each one more disturbing than the last. You're not alone, the game has begun, and you can't hide. The police investigated the cabin and the nearby shack, but found no evidence of the man in the photographs or any indication of his whereabouts. The woman I had rescued was traumatized, but could only offer fragmented memories of her captor, a man who had been watching her for weeks before he captured her. The unsettling feeling that someone was still watching me never left. I began to feel as though I was being hunted, that the man in the photographs was still out there, searching for me. I packed up my things and left the cabin behind, but the sense of dread followed me. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the shadowy figure from the photographs. Even now, as I try to move on with my life, the memories of the cabin and the man who lurked in the shadows haunt me. I can't escape the feeling of being watched and the fear that someone is always lurking just out of sight. The cabin on Piney Hill Lane remains a dark reminder of the nightmare that unfolded in those woods. A place where something truly sinister was hidden away, waiting for its next victim. I've always been a solitary person. There's something about being alone in nature that calms me, resets my mind. So, when work stress reached its peak, I decided to take a break and head out into the woods for a weekend of camping. I found a spot online, one of those places that's far enough from civilization to feel like an escape, but still within a few hours' drive. The reviews mentioned it was quiet, secluded, perfect for someone looking to reconnect. That sounded exactly like what I needed. I packed light, a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a book. The drive out was uneventful, the road winding through dense forests that seemed to swallow up the sunlight. The further I drove, the more I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. This was going to be good for me. I arrived at the trailhead around noon. There were a few cars parked there, but not as many as I had expected. I guess most people had already set up their campsites or maybe were out hiking. I took one last look at my phone. No signal, and then stuffed it into my pack. It was time to unplug. The hike to the campsite was supposed to be easy, just a couple of miles along a well-marked trail. As I walked, I felt myself falling into a rhythm, the sounds of the forest replacing the constant buzz of city life. Birds called out from the trees, and occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. It was the kind of solitude that made you feel at peace with the world. About halfway to the campsite, I noticed something strange. Every time I stopped walking, there was a faint rustling sound behind me. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. The forest was full of noises, after all, and it was probably just the wind or some small animal. But as I continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started glancing over my shoulder more frequently, but there was never anything there, just trees and shadows. When I finally reached the campsite, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. The site was more secluded than I had anticipated, with no sign of other campers and trees that closed tightly around the clearing. It was almost too quiet, but I convinced myself that was what I wanted. Peace and quiet, away from everything. I set up my tent quickly, trying to push away the unease that had been creeping up on me. The sound of the zipper closing on the tent felt like a small victory, a barrier between me and the unsettling silence outside. I gathered some wood and started a fire, the crackling flames bringing a bit of life back into the darkening woods. As night fell, the unease returned. The fire cast long, flickering shadows across the clearing, and the rustling sound was back, this time more distinct. It was closer now, circling the campsite. I strained to see beyond the firelight, but there was nothing out there, just darkness. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal curious about the fire, but that explanation didn't sit well with me. The footsteps sounded too deliberate, too heavy, and they always stopped the moment I stood up or shone my flashlight into the trees. I ate a quick dinner, barely tasting the food, my mind too preoccupied with the sounds around me. The rustling continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. It was like someone or something was watching me, toying with me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was alone out here. There was no reason to think otherwise. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it up tight, leaving just a small gap for ventilation. I lay there, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was safe. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the rustling, the footsteps moving closer and then fading away. Hours passed like this, trapped between exhaustion and fear, unable to fully relax but too tired to stay alert. Then, around midnight, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. The silence was deafening, and then there it was, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Breathing, right outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned my head to look at the tent wall. Through the thin fabric, I could see the outline of boots, large, heavy boots, standing just inches away. Whoever was out there was standing perfectly still, just breathing. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear. Felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I prayed that whoever it was would just go away, leave me alone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boots moved, slowly, deliberately. They stepped away from the tent. The breathing faded, and then the footsteps resumed, circling the campsite again. I waited until the sounds were far enough away before I let out the breath I'd been holding. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, listening, every nerve on edge. The footsteps continued, never straying too far from the campsite. Whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there, wanted me to feel their presence. As soon as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could. The footsteps had stopped sometime in the early morning, and the forest was eerily silent again. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started back down the trail, my senses on high alert. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees seeming to close in around me, the shadows darker than they had been the day before. About halfway back to the trailhead, I noticed something strange pinned to a tree. It was a small, worn-out photograph, the edges curled and yellowed with age. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the figure in the photo. It was me. The picture had been taken just the day before during my hike to the campsite. I was in mid-stride, looking off into the distance, completely unaware that I was being photographed. A cold chill ran down my spine as I scanned the surrounding woods. Someone had been following me, watching me, and they were still out there. I ripped the photo off the tree, crumpled it in my fist, and shoved it into my pocket. My hands were shaking as I resumed my hike, moving faster now, almost running. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was drenched in sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My car was the only one left in the parking lot, and the sight of it brought a wave of relief so intense that I nearly collapsed. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, before finally managing to unlock the door and throw my pack into the back seat. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods and watch me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me and the dense forest on either side. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of town. I pulled into a gas station and parked, my hands still shaking. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down, to convince myself that it was over. But the fear wouldn't go away. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled photograph. Staring at it, I couldn't help but wonder who had taken it and why. What did they want from me, and why had they left the photo for me to find? I turned the photo over, hoping to find some clue, something that would make sense of it all. There was nothing on the back, just a blank, yellowed surface. But as I held it up to the light, I noticed something faint, almost invisible, written in the corner. It was so small and faded that I had to squint to make it out. In tiny, almost illegible handwriting, it said, "See you soon." I dropped the photo as if it had burned me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. "See you soon." What did that mean? Was this some kind of sick joke? I suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable, as if I were still being watched. My eyes darted around the parking lot, scanning for any sign of someone lurking. But there was nothing, just the hum of traffic and the occasional car pulling in or out of the gas station. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But of course, there was still no signal. I cursed under my breath, feeling more isolated than ever. Without thinking, I started the car and drove away, my mind in a haze of fear and confusion. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to keep moving, to get as far away from those woods as possible. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that those eyes were still on me. Eventually, exhaustion set in, and I knew I couldn't keep driving forever. I found a small motel on the outskirts of a town I didn't recognize and checked in, paying in cash. The clerk gave me a strange look, probably wondering why I looked so rattled, but I didn't care. I just needed a place to hide, to think. The room was small and dingy, but it was safe. I locked the door, bolted it, and then shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. I pulled the curtains closed tight, leaving no gaps, and then collapsed onto the bed. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I kept replaying the events of the past 24 hours, trying to find some logical explanation. But there was none. The footsteps, the photograph, the message, none of it made any sense. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. My dreams were filled with dark, shadowy figures, always just out of sight, always watching. When I woke up, the room was dark, the only light coming from the neon sign outside the window. I sat up, feeling disoriented, and glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps outside my door. My heart leaped into my throat as I froze, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, just like they had been in the woods. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, my entire body tense. The door handle rattled, as if someone were testing it. And then came a soft, almost inaudible knock. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to do anything but listen. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Whoever was out there wasn't going away. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice, soft, calm, and terrifyingly familiar. "I told you I'd see you soon." The sound of that voice shattered whatever hold fear had on me. I bolted from the bed, grabbed my bag, and headed for the window. I didn't care that I was on the second floor. I just needed to get out of there. I threw open the window and jumped, landing hard on the ground below. Pain shot through my ankle, but I ignored it, scrambling to my feet and limping as fast as I could to my car. I didn't look back as I drove away, my mind racing with a single thought. I had to get away, as far away as possible. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that motel, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was still being watched, that those footsteps were still following me. And deep down, I knew that the next time I heard them, I might not be so lucky. The small, secluded house on Pine Hill Lane was a dream come true for me. After years of city life and the constant hustle, I wanted nothing more than to retreat to a place where I could find peace and quiet. The house was perfect, nestled among tall pine trees with a large backyard and a quaint front porch. The price was reasonable, and the solitude it promised was exactly what I needed. Moving in was a whirlwind of activity. I packed up my apartment, hired movers, and spent weeks unpacking and settling into my new home. The house was old but had character. Wooden floors, high ceilings, and a cozy fireplace made it feel warm and inviting. I was excited about my fresh start and eager to embrace the tranquility of my new surroundings. A few weeks after moving in, I started noticing strange things. It began with small, almost imperceptible signs. A door slightly ajar when I was sure I had closed it. The occasional sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway when I was alone. I dismissed these as the result of an overactive imagination, the kind of paranoia that often accompanies a new home. One evening, while sitting in the living room reading, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from upstairs. It was late, and I was alone in the house. The sound was intermittent, like someone trying to claw their way through the walls. I chalked it up to the house settling, or perhaps a branch scraping against the window. That night, I decided to go to bed early. I was exhausted from unpacking and wanted a full night's sleep. As I lay in bed, I heard the scratching sound again. It was louder now, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more frantic. Unable to sleep, I got up and grabbed a flashlight, deciding to investigate the source of the noise. As I climbed the stairs, the sound grew even more intense. It seemed to be coming from the attic. I reached the attic door and hesitated for a moment before turning the knob and pushing it open. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old boxes and forgotten items. I swept the flashlight around, trying to locate the source of the scratching. The noise had stopped, and the attic was eerily silent. I checked the room thoroughly but found nothing out of the ordinary. As I was about to leave, I noticed something unusual. There was a small, hidden door in the corner of the attic that I hadn't seen before. It was old and weathered with a rusty lock. My heart raced as I approached it, the scratching noise echoing in my mind. I tried to open the door, but it was locked tight. Deciding to leave it for the night, I went back to bed, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be behind that door. The next day, I went to the hardware store and bought a set of tools to break the lock. That evening, I returned to the attic with a sense of dread and anticipation. I used the tools to pry open the lock, and the door creaked as I pushed it open. The room beyond was small and dimly lit by the beam of my flashlight. It was filled with old furniture and boxes, but there was something more unsettling about it. In the far corner of the room, I saw a large wooden chest. It was old and covered in dust, with a padlock on it. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to open it. I used the tools to break the padlock, and the chest creaked open. Inside, there were several old newspapers, photographs, and a few pieces of clothing. The newspapers were yellowed with age, and the headlines were about a series of disappearances in the area. The photographs were even more disturbing, showing a series of people who had all vanished under mysterious circumstances. Among the photographs, I found one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of a man standing in front of a house that looked remarkably like mine. The man's face was obscured, but his eyes were visible, and they seemed to be staring directly at the camera. There was something unsettling about the gaze, almost as if he knew something that no one else did. The last item in the chest was a journal. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches. The notes detailed various experiments and observations about the people who had disappeared. The sketches depicted dark figures and shadowy shapes, along with disturbing notes about testing boundaries and revealing truths. As I read through the journal, a sense of dread grew stronger. The entries described the experiments conducted on the people who had vanished, with references to some sort of ritual or process involving their disappearance. The final entries were scrawled in frantic handwriting, detailing a plan to complete the process and ensure the experiment's success. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The journal hinted at something sinister happening in the house, and I realized that the scratching noises might have been the result of someone or something trying to escape. My hands trembled as I closed the chest and locked the hidden door. That night, I was unable to sleep. The house felt different, as though it was alive with a malevolent presence. The scratching sounds resumed, and I could hear faint whispers coming from the walls. The sense of being watched grew stronger, and the air felt heavier, as if something dark was lurking just out of sight. The following days were a blur of fear and anxiety. I started to notice other strange occurrences: objects moving on their own, doors creaking open, and cold spots in the house. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, and I felt a constant sense of unease. I decided to contact a local historian who might have more information about the house and its previous occupants. When I explained the situation, the historian was intrigued and agreed to help. She conducted her own research and discovered that the house had a dark history. It had once belonged to a man named Jonathan Carter, who was rumored to have been involved in occult practices and dark rituals. The historian found records of missing persons connected to Carter's house. The disappearances were linked to rumors of strange experiments and ritualistic practices. It seemed that Carter had been obsessed with uncovering hidden truths and had conducted experiments to push the boundaries of human understanding. As the days passed, the disturbances in the house grew more intense. The whispers became louder, and the scratching sounds turned into frantic pounding. It felt as though the house was alive with a malevolent energy, and I could no longer stay there. One night, after a particularly harrowing experience, I decided to leave. I packed my belongings in a panic, feeling a growing sense of dread. I put the house up for sale and moved out, hoping that someone else would be able to deal with the dark presence that I could not. Even now, as I try to rebuild my life, the memories of the house on Pine Hill Lane haunt me. The sense of being watched and the disturbing sounds never fully fade. The house remains a dark chapter in my life, a reminder of the terrifying secrets hidden within its walls.